Friends, today we're going to talk about how a British salesman who just wanted to fix a camera company ended up uncovering one of the biggest accounting frauds in corporate history and nearly got himself killed in the process. It's 2011. Tokyo. Olympus Corporation, the legendary Japanese brand that practically invented the modern camera, is worth about $8 billion. They've got 60,000 employees worldwide. They're a national treasure, basically. And in October of that year, they do something that shocks the entire business world. They fire their brand new CEO, the guy who's been with the company for 30 years, the guy they just promoted to the top job 6 months earlier. His name is Michael Woodford. He's British, he's a Liverpudlian, and the official reason for his firing: differences in management style. That's it, that's the official story. But here's what nobody knew at the time. Michael Woodford had just discovered something so massive, so absurdly brazen, that it would eventually force Japan's corporate establishment to its knees. And the question everyone would be asking, the question that haunts this entire story, is this: how do you hide $1.5 billion in losses for 20 years without anyone noticing? Let's go back to the beginning. Michael Woodford wasn't some hotshot Mia from a fancy business school. He was a 22-year-old kid from Liverpool who joined Olympus in 1981 as a medical equipment salesman. Just a regular guy selling endoscopes to hospitals in Europe. But he was good at it. Really good. He turned around Olympus's European operations, boosted revenues, built relationships, and slowly, over decades, he became the ultimate company man. He lived and breathed Olympus. He was loyal to a fault. By 2011, he had been appointed president and chief operating officer. And then, in April of that year, the chairman, a man named Tsuyoshi Kikukawa, called him into his office and offered him the top job. CEO, the first Westerner ever to lead a major Japanese corporation. It was a historic moment, a symbol of globalization, a sign that Japan was finally opening up. Woodford was over the moon. He'd given his entire career to this company. This was the ultimate validation. But here's the thing. He couldn't speak Japanese, and he couldn't read it either. That detail, that tiny, seemingly insignificant detail, would become the most important piece of this entire puzzle. Because while Woodford was running operations in Europe, the real power in Tokyo was being exercised in boardrooms where no English was spoken. And in those boardrooms, a secret had been festering for more than 2 decades. Now, to understand that secret, we have to go back even further, to the 1980s, the Japanese economic bubble. It was a time of absurd wealth in Japan. Stock prices went through the roof. Real estate was worth more than the entire United States. Companies were drowning in cash, and they didn't know what to do with it. So they got creative. They started playing the markets. They invested in foreign currencies, derivatives, complex financial instruments. In Japan, they called it zeiku, financial engineering, speculation for fun and profit. Olympus was no exception. They poured billions into these investments, and for a while it worked. Everyone was getting rich. The bubble kept inflating. But then, in 1990, it popped. The Japanese stock market crashed, real estate values collapsed, and Olympus found itself sitting on losses of nearly 100 billion yen, about $730 million at the time. A staggering sum, a catastrophic loss that could have destroyed the company. Now, here's where the story takes its first dark turn. A rational company would have reported the losses, taken the hit, and moved on. It would have been painful, but it would have been honest. But Olympus didn't do that. Instead, they made a collective decision. A conspiracy, really. They decided to hide the losses, to pretend they never happened. But how do you hide $700 million in losses? You can't just sweep that under the rug. You have to create a fiction, a parallel reality. And that's exactly what they did. They created a network of offshore shell companies, mostly in the Cayman Islands, and started shifting the losses around, moving them from one entity to another, like a magician moving cups on a table. The goal was simple: keep the losses off Olympus's official balance sheet, make the company look healthy and profitable when it was actually bleeding out. And here's the crazy part. It worked. For years. Decade after decade, the fraud continued. Executives came and went. Auditors signed off on the books. Nobody asked too many questions. Because in Japan, you don't rock the boat. You don't embarrass your bosses. You don't question authority. That's the cultural context that made this fraud possible. And that's why, when Michael Woodford finally discovered the truth, nobody in Tokyo wanted to hear it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to 2008, because that's when things got really weird. That's when Olympus made two acquisitions that made absolutely no sense to anyone who knew anything about business. First, they bought three tiny, obscure domestic companies. One sold face cream through mail order. Another made microwave-safe plastic dishes. The third was some kind of audio-visual equipment company. These companies were basically worthless. Combined, they were worth maybe a few $1 million. Olympus paid $773 million for them. Let that sink in. $750 million for a face cream company. Then, later that same year, Olympus made its biggest acquisition ever. They bought Gyrus Group, a British medical equipment company, for about $2 billion. That part actually made sense. Gyrus was a solid company with good technology. But here's where it got bizarre. On top of the purchase price, Olympus paid an additional $687 million in advisory fees and consultancy fees to two firms in the Cayman Islands. $687 million for advice. In the world of mergers and acquisitions, a typical advisory fee is around 1 to 2% of the deal value. For a $2 billion deal, that's about $20 million. $20 million is a lot of money, but $687 million, that's not a fee. That's a money launderer's fantasy. So how did nobody notice? How did the auditors, the regulators, the board of directors, the investment banks, how did all of them just look the other way? That's the question that would eventually tear Olympus apart. But in 2008, nobody was asking it. The company was making money. The stock was doing okay. The cameras were selling. Everything looked fine on the surface. But underneath, the fraud was metastasizing. And it was about to get exposed in the most unlikely way possible. In July 2011, a small Japanese magazine called Facta published an article that questioned the Gyrus acquisition. It pointed out the massive advisory fees and the suspicious timing of the payments. The article was published in Japanese, so Woodford didn't see it right away, but someone on his team translated it and brought it to his attention. And that was the moment everything changed. Woodford read that article and felt his stomach drop. Something was very, very wrong. He was the CEO now. The buck stopped with him. And if there was a problem with the Gyrus acquisition, he had to get to the bottom of it, fast. So he did what any responsible executive would do. He hired outside investigators. He brought in PricewaterhouseCoopers, Policy One, of the biggest accounting firms in the world. He told them to dig into the acquisitions. Find out where that $687 million actually went. Trace the money. Follow the paper trail. And what they found was absolutely staggering. The money had been funneled through a web of offshore shell companies, each one more convoluted than the last. It was like peeling an onion, except every layer smelled worse than the one before. The payments were structured to look like legitimate transaction fees, but they were really just a way to move money from Olympus's bank accounts into secret entities that were holding the old investment losses from the 1990s. In other words, the $687 million wasn't really a fee for the Gyrus deal. It was a repayment. A way to finally close the books on a 20-year-old mistake. The company was essentially paying off its own debt to itself, using fake transactions to make it look like they were doing business when they were really just covering their tracks. Woodford was stunned. He'd spent 30 years at Olympus. He'd given his entire life to this company. And now he was learning that it was built on a foundation of lies. But here's the thing. Even after he knew the truth, he still tried to handle it the right way. The Japanese way. He didn't go to the press. He didn't call the regulators. He went to his boss. He went to Chairman Kikukawa, the man who had promoted him, the man he'd trusted for years. And he said, "We have a problem." Kikukawa's reaction was not what Woodford expected. Instead of shock or concern, there was something else, something colder. The chairman told him that he was overreacting, that he didn't understand Japanese business practices, that these were just accounting technicalities, nothing to worry about. Woodford pressed further. He met with other senior executives, including the company's vice president, Hisashi Mori, and another top official named Hideo Yamada. He laid out the evidence. He showed them the paper trail. He explained exactly how the fraud worked, and they looked him in the eye and told him he was wrong. Now, imagine being in that position. You've discovered a billion-dollar fraud. You have the receipts, you have the documents, you've got a team of forensic accountants backing you up, and the people running the company are pretending nothing's wrong. They're gaslighting you, making you feel like the crazy one, the outsider, the foreigner who just doesn't get it. Woodford didn't back down. He couldn't. He'd taken an oath as CEO. He had a fiduciary duty to the shareholders. If he ignored this, he'd be complicit, and that was simply not an option. So he escalated. He called an emergency board meeting. He prepared a presentation. He walked into that room in October 2011, armed with evidence, ready to confront the board and force them to acknowledge the truth. But they were ready for him too. The board had changed the agenda without telling him. They'd stacked the meeting with their allies. And when Woodford stood up to present his findings, they shut him down. They didn't let him speak. They didn't let him defend himself. They just voted, unanimously, to fire him. That's right. The CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, the man who'd uncovered a massive criminal conspiracy, was fired by the very people he was trying to save. The official reason? Differences in management style. It was a joke, a slap in the face, but it was also a signal, a message. The old guard was telling Woodford and everyone else that they would do whatever it took to protect the secret. They would sacrifice anyone, even their own CEO. Woodford was escorted out of the building. His security clearance was revoked. His email account was disabled. He was cut off from the company he'd served for 3 decades. Just like that. 30 years of loyalty wiped out in 30 minutes. And now he faced a terrifying choice. He could walk away, take a settlement, sign a non-disclosure agreement, go back to England with his reputation intact and his bank account full. It would have been the easy path, the path of least resistance. Or he could fight back. He could blow the whistle. He could go to the press and tell the world what he'd found. But that path came with risks, serious risks. Because Japan has a dark underbelly, and companies with billion-dollar secrets sometimes turn to people who specialize in keeping secrets quiet. The Yakuza. The Japanese organized crime syndicates. They have a long history of being hired by corporations to intimidate, threaten, and sometimes worse. Woodford had heard the rumors. He knew that people who crossed powerful Japanese companies sometimes had accidents. He knew that the walls in Tokyo had ears. He knew that if he went public, he would be putting himself and his family in danger. So he did the only thing he could do. He ran. He got on a plane and flew to London, and then he started talking to the BBC, to the Financial Times, to any journalist who would listen. He laid out the whole story. The Zaitku losses, the shell companies, the Mickey Mouse acquisitions, the $687 million fees. He gave them the documents. He gave them the names. He gave them everything. And the international media went absolutely ballistic. This wasn't just a corporate scandal. This was a cultural earthquake. The first Western CEO of a major Japanese corporation had been fired for discovering fraud, and he was blowing the whistle on live television. It was unprecedented. It was sensational, and it was about to bring Olympus to its knees. But back in Tokyo, the company was still in denial. They issued a statement calling Woodford's allegations groundless. They said he was a disgruntled former employee with a vendetta. They said he didn't understand Japanese accounting standards. They circled the wagons and prepared for war. For weeks, the battle raged in the press. Woodford gave interviews. Olympus gave press conferences. The stock started to wobble. Investors got nervous. The Japanese media, which had initially been reluctant to cover the story for fear of losing Olympus's advertising dollars, finally started paying attention. The dam was about to break. And then, on November 8, 2011, it did. Olympus held a press conference in Tokyo. The top executives stood at the podium, their faces grim, their voices trembling, and they admitted it. All of it. The fraud. The shell companies, the fake acquisitions, the 2-decade cover-up. They admitted that they had inflated the company's net worth by hiding massive investment losses. They admitted that the $687 million in advisory fees was a sham. They admitted that the face cream company, the microwave dish company, the whole parade of absurd acquisitions, it was all a smokescreen. The stock price collapsed. In a matter of days, Olympus lost about 80% of its market value. $8 billion evaporated. Pension funds were wiped out. Small investors lost their life savings. The company was placed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange's watch list and faced the very real threat of delisting. Tsuyoshi Kikukawa, the chairman who had promoted Woodford and then fired him, resigned. So did Hisashi Mori and Hideo Yamada. They were arrested a few months later. They faced trial. They pleaded guilty. They received suspended prison sentences. A slap on the wrist, really, given the scale of the crime. But here's the thing. Even after all of that, even after the admissions and the apologies and the court cases, the question remained. The question that nobody could quite answer. How did this go on for so long? Let's really think about that question for a second. 20 years. 2 decades. That's not a typo. That's not an exaggeration. From 1990 to 2011, Olympus ran a massive multi-billion-dollar fraud and nobody, not the auditors, not the regulators, not the board, not the shareholders, not the media, nobody caught it. How is that even possible? Well, let's look at the enablers. Because this fraud wasn't a one-man show, it was a symphony of complicity. And the first players in that orchestra were the auditors. Olympus used 2 of the biggest accounting firms in the world, KPMG ASA and Ernst & Young Shinihan. These are not fly-by-night operators. These are the Big Four, the gold standard of financial scrutiny. They have thousands of professionals, sophisticated algorithms, rigorous procedures. They're supposed to be the watchdogs, the guardians of corporate integrity. And they signed off on the fraud, year after year, decade after decade. Now, to be fair, the fraud was sophisticated. The shell companies were in the Cayman Islands. The paperwork was convoluted. The transactions were structured to look legitimate. But still, $687 million in advisory fees? A face cream company bought for $250 million? These weren't subtle red flags. These were giant neon signs flashing fraud in 50-foot letters. So why did the auditors miss it? Some of it was incompetence. Some of it was negligence. But some of it was something deeper, something more troubling. Because when the investigative committee finally looked into the auditor's role, they found something astonishing. Every single one of the Big Four accounting firms was somehow involved. KPMG had failed to notice the fraud in the first place. Ernst & Young had signed off on the fraudulent accounts. Deloitte had been hired to investigate the fraud after it was exposed. And PAP had been hired by Woodford to uncover it in the first place. It was like a circular firing squad of accounting failure. The entire industry was complicit. But the auditors weren't the only ones who looked the other way. There were the banks, too. Financial institutions that provided loans to the offshore shell companies, knowing full well that the loans were effectively guaranteed by Olympus. They knew the money was being funneled back into the company. They knew it was a shell game. But they played along anyway, because the fees were good and nobody was asking questions. And then there was the board of directors, the so-called independent directors, the people who were supposed to oversee management and protect shareholder interests. Here's a mind-blowing detail that perfectly captures the dysfunction. One of Olympus's non-executive directors was a doctor. a medical doctor. He admitted, under oath, that he didn't understand the financial discussions at the board meetings. He said he was basically there to provide medical advice if anyone got sick. That's right, a doctor, on the board of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, sitting in meetings where billion-dollar transactions were being discussed. And he didn't understand any of it. This is the kind of detail that sounds like a joke, but it's absolutely true. It tells you everything you need to know about corporate governance in Japan at the time. The board wasn't there to challenge management. It was there to rubber stamp, to provide legitimacy, to create the illusion of oversight while the real decisions were made behind closed doors. And then there was the Japanese media, the Fourth Estate, the supposed guardians of truth and transparency. For weeks after Woodford went public, the major Japanese newspapers and television networks barely covered the story. They buried it. They downplayed it. They treated it like a minor corporate squabble, not the biggest financial scandal in Japanese history. Why? Because Olympus was a major advertiser. They bought millions of dollars in ad space every year, and in Japan, the relationship between media and corporations is cozy, too cozy. Journalists don't want to bite the hand that feeds them, so they stayed quiet. The story was eventually broken by a small, independent magazine called Facta, a niche publication with a tiny circulation. They didn't care about Olympus's advertising dollars because they didn't have any. They just followed the story wherever it led, and it led to the truth. But the thing that really makes this story unforgettable, the thing that turns it from a financial scandal into a human tragedy, is the toll it took on Michael Woodford. Because while the world was watching the drama unfold, Woodford was living through a nightmare. He was isolated. He was terrified. He was being called a traitor, a liar, a disgruntled foreigner who didn't understand Japanese culture. His reputation was being shredded in the press. His career was over. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed was gone. His wife, who had supported him through 30 years of corporate climbing, suffered from severe anxiety. She couldn't sleep. She'd wake up in the middle of the night shaking. The constant fear, the threats, the uncertainty. It took a physical toll. She became a shadow of herself. Woodford himself started drinking heavily. He became dependent on sleeping pills just to get through the night. He'd lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd made the right choice, wondering if he should have just taken the settlement and kept his mouth shut, wondering if it was all worth it. And all the while, he was fighting a battle on two fronts, against Olympus, who was trying to discredit him, and against his own doubts, which were eating him alive. But he kept fighting. He kept talking to the press. He kept giving interviews. He kept telling the truth, because he believed, deep down, that the truth mattered, that exposing the fraud was more important than protecting his own reputation, that the shareholders, the employees, the pensioners, they deserved to know what had happened to their company. And eventually he was vindicated. The fraud was exposed. The executives were arrested. The company was forced to clean up its act. Woodford won a wrongful dismissal settlement of about $16 million, a small consolation for losing the career he dedicated his life to. But here's the thing. Even after everything that happened, even after the arrests and the apologies and the reforms, Woodford's story raises one final, haunting question. A question that lingers long after the credits roll. What would you have done in his position? Would you have spoken up, knowing the risks, knowing you might destroy your career, your reputation, your family's safety? Or would you have stayed quiet, taken the money, and let the fraud continue? Because the truth is, most people stay quiet. Most people look the other way. Most people convince themselves that it's not their problem, that someone else will take care of it, that the risks are too high. And that's exactly how frauds like this keep going for 20 years. It takes a special kind of person to stand up and say, "This is wrong." It takes courage. It takes integrity. It takes the willingness to sacrifice everything for the truth. Michael Woodford had that courage. And because he did, one of the biggest accounting frauds in history was finally brought to light. But here's the question that still haunts me. The question I leave you with tonight. The question that has no easy answer. How many other corporations are hiding secrets just as dark, with whistleblowers too scared to speak up. The scary part? We'll probably never know, until someone like Woodford comes along. If you like my effort, please like, share, and subscribe my channel.